pass from hand to yearning hand, and the vision of our fathers spread hope throughout this land, as the dream some fought and died for in my heart becomes my own. I will strive to keep her promise, America, my home. America, America, may God bless America, and freedom reign across America, my home. From the shorelines to the prairies, to the cities great and small, we have reaped the fruits of justice and liberty for all. So
with deep appreciation for the blessings of freedom that we know in this great country of ours, this is Dr. George Simon. Welcome once again to another edition of Character Matters. The problem that I believe is plaguing our country and much of the free world, much of the world these days, and causing so much havoc in the political realm, in the social realm, in the economic realm, is the character crisis that we see. And this is the program where we talk about this problem and what we can possibly do to make it better. And tonight's program is going to be a really interesting program because we're going to touch on a lot of subjects that are relevant to some of the news that has been really very interesting this week. We've had some very politically charged situations develop. We've had stories in Texas of the governor there being indicted, and cries of foul play, politically biased foul play. We've had the situation in the suburb of St. Louis, and we've had the tragic loss of Robin Williams, just one in a series of tragic losses of entertainment figures near and dear to us who seem to have struggled unsuccessfully with various demons. And we're going to be talking about those things as well. And I invite you to join the discussion at area code 718-717-8296. That's 718-717-8296. If you want to join the discussion, we have many things to talk about. One of the things I really wanted to point out to you tonight before we even begin the discussion is just how difficult it is these days to have an honest discussion about anything. Really, we live in an age where political correctness rules, and unfortunately, in our days of political correctness and in our days of extra sensitivity, not wanting to offend various folks, it is really difficult to have a no-holds-barred, honest discussion about anything. And if ever there were a need for that, it would be now. We have come to a point where we really have a lot of information on our hands. We're learning so much and at such an accelerated pace that it's not funny. But we can't honestly discuss openly and freely our opinions about many of the things that we've learned and many of the things that we know. because many times we fear that we will say something or do something that will evoke the ire of someone else, or folks come to the discussion table with preconceived notions, with preconceived ideas, with biases that prevent them from keeping an open mind. And if we're ever going to resolve our problems, if we're ever going to solve especially our social problems, even our economic problems, the need for an open, free, and fair, and unbiased, honest discussion could not be greater. So tonight, I encourage those who do call at 718-717-8296 to keep that in mind. We want to keep the discussion honest, free, fair, but above and beyond all, honest. As host and as moderator, I will do my best to also be fair and honest in the discussion, and to exercise veto authority, should we say, if there's any content, which I can't imagine on this program. We know fairly much about our listenership that we probably don't have to worry about that. But just in case we get some stray call whose the purpose of which is merely to offend or to put out information or to make comments that are blatantly hostile or bigoted or anything like that, we'll exercise that veto power. But I think basically this is a forum in which we should be able to have an honest and free discussion, and we really need it. I have some interesting material I think you'll find posted on my blog at www.manipulative-people.com. This Friday's post is the second to the last in a series on abusive characters, those personality types most prone to various kinds of abuse. So you'll find some interesting comments by the blog readers and also some interesting material, I believe, on the blog. Next week, on the manipulative-people.com blog, we're going to have the wrap-up post on the abuse series, and it's going to involve one of the darkest sides of abuse that there is and the kinds of individuals that perpetrate this abuse. I've gotten a lot of requests, several emails, just in the last couple of months alone, and actually a spike in emails over the last couple of weeks, with folks wanting me to talk about some of the sexual abusers. For those of you who have gone online already and gone to my website at www.drgeorgesimon.com or my blog at www.manipulative-people.com, you know that I have experience actually in that area, many years experience, and actually did for a time head up my state's assessment program for sexual offenders, and conducted over 1,000 interviews and did over 1,000 assessments on all types of offenders, and actually worked up complete modifications, complete revamps of several of the treatment programs, as well as was active on our state's commission for domestic abuse, rape, child abuse, and violence. So I have some experience there, and I'm going to be sharing some thoughts on that on the blog. And so for those of you who have questions or concerns in that area, it'd be a good time to tune into the blog. The post will hit sometime next Friday. usually about 5 p.m. or they're slightly thereafter Eastern Time. 4 p.m. Central Time is when the posts usually hit the blog. So you can pay a visit to the blog, and I'll have that post up there on Friday. But tonight, I really want to talk about some of the things that have been in the news tonight. I thought I'd first start out by saying a few things about the untimely death of Robin Williams. I'm not an expert per se in the field of depression science, but early in my career, working with both victims of disturbed characters as well as disturbed characters, I came to an interesting insight. I've talked about this on the program before. I had learned all the various models of depression, and one of the models that stuck out in my mind was an experimental model out of laboratory research using animals. And the model was the learned helplessness model, and it involved laboratory rats basically learning in a controlled environment that nothing that they did would allow them to make a difference in their environment. Sometimes it was trying to escape painful situations, and then what they learned in these controlled studies, the experiment was set up in such a way that no matter what they did, they were not able to escape adverse consequences. They were not able to escape electric shock, for example, or some other things. And basically, when they tried all they needed to do and found that nothing they did made a difference, they basically just gave up. They became what we call anhedonic. In other words, they lost the pleasure, the zest for life. They became despondent. They lost any motivation to do anything, and they just basically gave up. They learned that they were helpless, and therefore that helplessness turned into hopelessness. And this model really stuck out with me. And I remembered it often in the back of my mind when I was dealing with victims of abusive situations and victims in situations with disturbed characters, in relationships with disturbed characters of various types. And what I realized was these folks were doing all kinds of personal investing trying to make their situations better. In other words, because the disturbed character in their life wasn't lifting a finger to make anything better, that person, the disturbed character in the relationship, liked who they are and the way they did things, even though everybody else was miserable because of them. They liked who they were and the way they did things, and they didn't lift a finger to make anything different. Meanwhile, the person on the receiving end of their behavior did all kinds of things to try and make things better. They invested their time and they invested their energy. But nothing they did seemed to make a difference. They tried being more attentive. They tried being more accommodating. Nothing seemed to work. They tried to be more assertive. They tried all kinds of things, and nothing seemed to work. Many times, unfortunately, these folks had either their own preconceived notions about why the disturbed character in their life was behaving in the way they did, because they were versed in some way with the traditional psychology and made assumptions like, well, underneath it they must be really insecure, Underneath it, maybe they're commitment phobic. Underneath it, underneath this abusive, disregarding behavior, maybe they are struggling with low self-esteem. They made all the traditional assumptions because those are the kinds of things they'd heard over the years. Or maybe, even worse, they had tried to get help in a traditional therapy venue, and they were actually told such things. So, to make a long story short, they invested their time and their energy. They poured their heart into trying to make things better. And no matter what they did, there was no difference. They had no power to make things different. And not recognizing in their hearts and in their minds that when you put your energy toward and direct your energy toward people, places, and things over which you inherently have no power, you're going to experience this kind of frustration, and you're going to eventually have to reckon with feelings of powerlessness, feelings of helplessness that can easily turn to feelings of hopelessness. It's very much like what happens in the stages of death and dying. You suffer this loss, this tremendous sense of loss, because nothing you do makes a difference. At first you get angry and frustrated, but it isn't long before you turn that anger onward toward yourself, recognizing that you actually are the culprit in your despondency because you are powerless, you are ineffective. And it never really occurs to you that that's really the way it should be. The only power that you really have is over your own behavior. You have the power to choose. You have the power to take action. That's where all your power lies. But this usually doesn't occur to you when you're kind of tied up in a manipulative, abusive relationship. So I realized early on that this learned helplessness model was really at work in victims of abusive relationships. And I came to realize, studying case after case after case of individuals who came to me with problems of one type or another that involved some level of depression, that this dynamic, shall we say, was almost always at work. In other words, at the root of someone's despondency was most often the fact that they were heavily invested in something emotionally, heavily invested in putting a lot of time and energy and attentional focus on trying to secure something, trying to make something happen, trying to get something in their life that they did not have the power. They just did not have the power to make happen. And in the process, they eventually became angry, frustrated, and sooner or later despondent and depressed. Now, not every depressed person goes through this cycle, but it is very common. There are very, very few cases of purely biochemical depression that simply has its roots in some kind of haywire biochemical imbalance with no precipitating cause. In other words, the chemistry gets just off for some reason, and for no apparent reason. It just does. We used to call this endogenous depression. This is an extremely rare kind of thing. A depression that's not reactive to anything. In other words, it doesn't occur in response to some stressor, but it's just part of an abnormal chemistry that the person really has no control over, and there's no event that precipitates it. These kinds of depressions are extremely rare. Most of the time, the person is invested in something, yearning for something, hoping for something, striving for something, trying to make something happen that they haven't the power to make happen. And in the process, they will slowly and steadily become angry, frustrated, despondent, and depressed. I've seen this happen over and over and over and over again. Now, when these purely biochemically based depressions occur, there is another nasty little culprit. And quite frankly, remember I said we need to have an honest discussion? Well, here's an honest discussion, folks, and this is very politically incorrect. I know it. But for the sake of an honest discussion, we're going to talk about it. The culprit in some of these biochemically based depressions, especially when it comes to suicidal ideation, the culprit is many times the medication, not just the psychiatric medication, not just the medication that is specifically designed to alter a mood, but other medications that can produce changes in serotonin levels, changes in other biochemical levels, and that can actually increase the risk of self-harm. You know, it wasn't long ago. It was just a couple of decades ago that certain powers in this country, vested interests, spent millions of dollars on a campaign, a nationwide deliberate campaign. I read the trade magazines, the journals, in both my field and even in the psychiatric field. And there was a deliberate, calculated campaign starting in the late 80s and early 90s to completely reframe the debate on depression. You know, prior to the advent of these powerful antidepressant medicines, there were a few medicines that had some effect, but they also had some nasty side effects, and so strictly medically based treatments for depression were not all that common. Instead, folks had more traditional talk therapy and other therapies, and folks tried to get to the bottom of what was going on and help people work through their depression. And in many cases, I should not say in many cases, but in a fair number of cases, in a significant number of cases, personality and character variables were at play in someone's depression. For example, some folks, as I mentioned in my books, in Sheep's Clothing and Character Disturbance, especially character disturbance, which is a much more in-depth study of character formation, personality formation. There is a group of individuals, a small group, whereby in growing and developing as a result of some constitutional factors and as a result of the experience that shaped them early on, there are some individuals whose personalities are defined by their excessive passivity and their emotional dependency. These are your stereotypic doormats in relationships, people who basically are willing to be led by others and therefore sometimes trampled upon by others because they don't have the skills. They denied themselves the opportunity basically to learn the skills, or they were denied the opportunity to learn the skills to better take care of themselves. Well, these individuals are quite prone to depressive episodes, especially when they lose a source of support upon whom they've been relying. In other words, if they're already so emotionally dependent that they need basically a stronger somebody to lean on to feel like they can handle life's concerns, if they lose that support, somebody dies, leaves them, abandons them in a relationship, they feel like they can't cope. And they can easily slip into a period of despondency. So what I'm trying to say here is that we recognized that in some cases, in a significant number of cases, that there were individual character variables at work that predisposed individuals. I'll give you another example. Individuals who tend to be very narcissistic and who tend to be very grandiose in their narcissism, who have unbridled imaginations, visions of greatness, and who can really gin themselves up into some dramatic highs, can sometimes go off the deep end, and sometimes their disturbance of mood will be of a more hypomanic type. But then reality many times can come crashing in. You know, these folks who think they're all that and they've got the world by the tail, sometimes they go way too far, do that one thing that gets them into trouble, thinking they're invincible, and then the world comes crashing down around them, and then the next thing you know, they want to end it all. Because reality has told them, hey, look, Buster, or look, sister, this is not exactly the party you thought it was. So we did recognize that in a fair number of cases, there were character issues at play. There were character issues that impacted the kinds of symptoms and the kinds of clinical conditions that people have. Well, there was a deliberate campaign with tons of money behind it to wipe that notion completely out of people's minds. The AMA and the APA set out deliberately, and they said so proudly in their journals and in their trades. They set out proudly to convince everyone, both the medical community, the helping community, and the general public, that it was basically malpractice to even consider that depression was anything but biochemistry, and therefore needed strictly medical intervention. It wasn't a matter of character, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it isn't. Remember, that's the honest discussion that we have to have. But sometimes there's more to it than just the biochemistry. But nonetheless, this massive campaign went on, and before long, antidepressants were being popped out there like popcorn. They were being passed around. And here's another interesting fact. that you may or may not know. But, these drugs are potent. Drugs are potent. They have side effects, and in some cases, especially when it comes to suicidal ideation, when you're trying to get the dosage just right, or if someone is being sketchy in their compliance, the risk of self-harm with some of these drugs goes through the roof, because people start having these self-harming thoughts that they didn't have before, or with a renewed intensity that they didn't have before. So there really needs to be close monitoring by someone who really knows what the heck they're doing. And here's the dirty little secret. Most, the vast majority of these drugs are prescribed by general practitioners with no specialized training and without close supervision. Now, with that as a backdrop, let me say a little bit about the tragic death of Robin Williams. And not just Robin. It wasn't too long ago we had the tragic death of Philip Seymour Hoffman. We have had so many high-profile instances of this, just this year alone. But I want to say that you're talking about a situation in which the very best of care was available. I heard all the talking heads on TV when all the news programs were just full of Robin Williams, all Robin all the time, basically, for 3 or 4 days. It was just nothing but that. And I heard all the talking heads say virtually the same thing. So if you know someone, please, if you know someone who doesn't see themselves, or who you suspect is falling into depression, or who has had a problem with substances or whatever, please have them seek help. Well, here's the dirty little secret, folks. This is a person who did seek help. This is a person who did seek help. And we don't know all the facts yet. But one of the medications involved in Robin's medication regimen may have actually been a factor here. We don't know that yet. We'll have to find out. So I think that's probably the bigger tragedy. The bigger tragedy is that when you look at suicide rates, they're still unacceptably high, despite the revolution that the AMA spearheaded 20 years ago. We have all this knowledge, all this awareness, and all these fancy prescriptions that we can write, all these miracle drugs, and people still die. If we're doing it so right, here's a really honest and thought-provoking question for you. If we're really doing it so right, why are so many people still dying? Why do we have such a problem that we do? Here's another thing to consider. Let's take the situation of depression that is not really at the clinical level. Let's talk about relatively low levels of despondency that have much more to do with a person's lifestyle and their inadequate coping and the kind of stress that they put themselves under and the inadequate ability that they have to manage that stress. Or they're in a situation that where they really need to make a change. One of the problems I see with just having a feel-good pill or a set of feel-good pills, something to chill out the anxiety, something to take that away, and something to elevate your mood. One of the problems with that is, and I consider this a huge problem, is that, when nature is telling us that something's really wrong, nature is asking us to take a look at those environmental circumstances and also the way we're coping, and to think about making some changes. That's what nature is telling us. But when we take a pill, or two, or a combination to make things better, so that we can keep on functioning, and basically keep on doing just exactly as we have been doing, we only enable the problem. In my years of practice as a therapist, I can tell you unequivocally, I have no reservations about this. Hundreds of times I witnessed folks who basically lost any motivation to make any meaningful changes once they started feeling better. They stopped paying attention to nature's distress signals. There's this disease, I don't have it right on the top of my head, sorry about that, but there is a disease, a neurological disease, where basically people lose the ability to experience pain. Sometimes the interruption can be in the neurotransmitters that transmit the signals that tell the brain that there's pain. Sometimes it can be in the brain centers itself. But for one reason or another, the individuals lose their ability to experience pain. Well, this is a really dangerous clinical condition to have. Why? Well, you could put your hand on a hot burner, and you wouldn't know that your flesh is roasting until you smell it, perhaps. Till you hear the flesh sizzling, because you can't feel the pain. You can do yourself an awful lot of damage because you lose the ability to get that feedback, that natural feedback, that something is amiss, that you've done something that you really need to take corrective action about. So that pain is nature's gift to us. It tells us, whatever it is that we're touching, tasting, wherever it is we're going, whatever it is we're doing, something's wrong, and we need to both explore that, find the source of it, and take some kind of corrective action. That's the way it is sometimes. Not all the time, but that's the way it is sometimes too, especially with low levels of depression or despondency. Frankly, many times, the unhappiness that people experience really doesn't rise to the level that it should even be diagnosed as depression. Okay, here's another really honest and open discussion. Many times, I'll say this again, many times, the kinds of unhappiness someone is having is technically not depression. It is the natural response to an adverse circumstance, and it's nature's way of telling us that we need to do something differently. And many times, an unhappy person will present their symptoms, and because the person providing treatment plans on using either some kind of therapeutic procedure or especially medicine to alleviate the unhappiness, they will make the diagnosis when in fact no diagnosis is warranted of a clinical level of depression. And sometimes that can be damaging for a lot of reasons. I mentioned earlier some of the potential side effects and adverse reactions that can occur with these powerful drugs. That's just one problem. But the other problem is that when folks are not paying attention, basically, to what it is that needs correction in their environment, what kinds of course corrections they need to implement in their life to make things better, and they lose sight of that, don't pay attention to that, don't do anything about that because they're feeling better now because either a pill has made them happy or because they're talking to somebody and they're getting some relief and they're venting, and they don't change anything. This is a problem. This is a real problem. So, I wanted to say some things about it because I've heard a lot of commentators on all the programs, news programs, talk shows, whatnot, talking about this tragedy. And I've not really heard very many folks, as a matter of fact, I haven't heard anybody really talk about the state of affairs. I've heard so many folks urge folks, please get help, please get help. Well, you know, even some of these crazy shooters who were on SSRIs got help, were under care of some kind. I realize compliance is an issue, but that again speaks to why we should not be, especially with folks who are not really compliant, be prescribing powerful drugs that can have negative consequences. And that's just one aspect of where we also all should be looking at the state of our art of providing care here. More and more folks now have overcome the stigma and are seeking help for mental conditions of one type or another. That's a great thing. That is an absolutely great thing. But our outcome studies are not really showing, that we have made huge dents in some of the most troubling statistics. We have not. So that's the other side of the story. One of the reasons why I began doing the work that I have been doing for the last 30 years is that so many people were telling me, especially when it came to trying to get help for disturbed characters, that the help they sought wouldn't do any good. Many of the callers to this program have had that exact same thing to say, and many of the commentators on my blog at manipulative-people.com have had that exact same thing to say. By the way, once again, if you want to join the conversation, it's 718-717-8296. That's 718-717-8296. I want to say just one other thing about Robin Williams, and not just about him in particular, but about something that was a little troubling. I make a point in Character Disturbance about a mistake that we have made as a culture, and we're not the only ones guilty of this. The kinds of things that we value. Now, actually, with Robin, it was a little different because Robin, apparently, I didn't know him. He grew up not too far from me, but I did not know him personally. But from all I have read from his friends and all I have been able to learn about him, apparently he was a pretty great guy as well. He had his character flaws, to be sure. We all do. He had some issues, with substance abuse, and it wasn't just alcohol. It was not just alcohol. And by the way, last time I looked, many of these abusable drugs, highly abusable drugs, and really problematic drugs that are such widespread use in Hollywood circles. Last time I looked, most of these drugs are illegal. So it takes a certain amount of character deficiency to even go there the first time. Nobody puts a gun to your head and makes you break the law. But that's a little aside the point I'm wanting to make here. So in his case, it was not so much to the issue I want to speak to, because I do understand that he really was a really decent sort for the most part. But what troubled me about the coverage, and what troubled me about many of the commentators' remarks, was all the focus on his talent. How tragic it was to lose this wit that he was gifted with. And I speak to this in numerous articles online, both on manipulative-people.com and on the counseling resource.com website as well. And in both of my books, especially in Character Disturbance, I go into great length about this. But this business that we have, this habit that we have of lauding people, of heaping praise and admiration and attention on folks, and of giving them credit for things that they can't possibly claim credit for. This wit, this natural talent, this ability, which truly, yes, he developed. Raw talent, of course, usually goes nowhere. You have to do your part. I'm not taking that away from Robin or anybody else. But this unbelievable fawning that we do as a culture over somebody's gifts is a horrendous mistake. It is one of the main reasons that we live in the age of grandiosity and entitlement. It is one of the reasons why narcissism is so prevalent in our culture. Because we just go crazy over what someone's natural gifts and talents and abilities are. It's one of the reasons why we so overpay our star athletes, etc., etc. We're just so enamored of these abilities. It's just one of the factors. Whereas we don't give enough attention to what matters. And what matters? Well, as the title of this program speaks to, I believe, more than anything else, for our own welfare and for our welfare as a society, more than anything else, what matters is character. And when we have these situations, when one of our so-called heroes shows themselves to be who they really are in character, do something awful. Just this past week, another sports figure beating up, not just manhandling, but beating up a girlfriend. When we give this stuff a pass, by the way, the NFL has just passed, they've just amended their rules to where repeat offenders, now get this, repeat offenders will face a mandatory 1-year suspension without pay. Well, it's a step in the right direction, folks. That's a step in the right direction, but we're talking about, once should be enough, frankly. And this sanction is for repeat offenders. And it's taken all this time to do that. Because what we value is, we don't value that person's character first and foremost. It's not about that anymore. It's about, do they have the talent to help us win so that we can line our pockets as a franchise? That's what it's about. That's what it's about. And so long as that's where our priorities are as a culture, and so long as we value people for what they bring to the table in the way of talent as opposed to what they bring to the table in the way of their character, this character crisis will go on and it will get worse because it is just what we have asked for. We will get what we've asked for. Now, I'm not taking sides on this political thing one way or the other. I wanted to mention briefly also another news item, and that's the Rick Perry thing. Believe me, I am such a fierce independent, it's not funny. Because I think both sides of the political spectrum really need to be taken out behind the shed. I really do. I have virtually no tolerance for either extreme. I really don't. Because both sides come into the political debate with their own preconceived notions and whatnot, and we can't have an honest discussion on anything, and that's why we have such stalemate. But Governor Perry, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this story, but he's got the head of a commission who's supposed to be a model of integrity, who gets arrested for driving drunk, clearly drunk, and then being typically rude and hostile during arrest, having too much to drink, to the arresting officer, and being an embarrassment, not only to her office, but also to the state as a public service. And Governor Perry wanted this person to step down, and the person wouldn't do it. And so Governor Perry decided that he, in a strong arm move, and this is where all the trouble started, would use his veto power to veto funding for this agency that this woman holds, so long as she's there. Not punishing the agency personally, but withholding the funds until she leaves, so that it can't operate until she goes. And in a tit-for-tat manner, now he's been indicted on charges of abuse of power. And this is what our political arena has come to, folks. Now, I said I'm not taking sides in this. And the reason I'm not taking sides in this is because I believe that there are character issues on both sides of this equation. But what it exemplifies to me more than anything else is that character doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter to anybody. I do believe that this lawsuit would not have been brought. Even folks on the Democratic side of things, because this is a Democrat office holder who won't resign, and of course Perry's a Republican. Even folks on the Democratic side are saying that this indictment for abuse of power smells a little fishy and looks purely political. Well, Come on, folks. But it no longer seems to matter to us. And people not only hold office, but they get paid ungodly sums. You had folks in the VA. You had doctors and administrators who are already paid handsomely and with benefits that you and I would love to have, who were cooking the books, fudging things, and letting people die just to get their bonuses, and they still have their bonuses, and not one head has rolled. For those folks directly responsible. There are hundreds of them, directly responsible, and who took the money. And they're still there. And so long as we as a country say character doesn't matter, we will get what's coming to us. This crisis is getting out of control. It is really getting out of control. How many deaths will it take? How many shoot-em-ups will it take? How many oppressive laws will it take in our crazy, absolutely crazy scheme to legislate every bit of morality and burden those few of us who are left, who are still trying to carry the weight of responsibility for doing our best to make things work, to make our relationships work, to raise our families, to do a good job at our jobs, to be people of integrity. This crazy notion that we should burden these folks even more by passing even more rules and regulations because there are other folks among us who don't give a care about anything but themselves, or their money, or their fame, or their prestige. We have to decide as a culture in this country if character is going to matter at all anymore. And if we don't, and we don't do something about it actively, we will continue to get just exactly what we've been asking for. And that is a country in economic decline. We are not living any better than we used to. There's a very small percentage that is. There's a 1% in this country is doing very, very well. And 5% is doing pretty well. But the rest? Nope. Not at all. As a matter of fact, not quite as well as they used to. You got two people grinding it out, working hard at two full-time jobs and still barely making ends meet. That is not the American dream. The once thriving middle class has just about disappeared. We have to decide that character matters. We have to demand it in our bosses, in our law enforcement officials, in our government officials, in our elected representatives. We have to decide that it matters everywhere. And once we do, we'll be great again. See you next week.